Okay, so this is the second video on World War One, getting into the war at home. Actually, so World War One is kind of the first use of this new, highly centralized, progressive, central administrative state in its first grand challenge, which was World War One. Number of things are different about World War One besides the obvious military technology, the introduction of machine guns, the introduction of tanks. You also have the first, sorry about the light, here we go, the first wide-scale use of conscription in American history. So the United States did have conscription in in the Civil War, but it wasn't using a centralized bureaucratic state. What they would do is they would ask for levies from the individual state areas. They would go in and grab people. So one of the things that happened in the Spanish-American War was there was a call put out for a certain number of volunteers, and 3 times that number showed up. And so during the Spanish-American War, they literally had more bodies than they knew what to do with. So when the United States, shortly after declaring war in April of 1917, the same month, Congress passes the Selective Service Act. By the way, the Selective Service Act is still in force today, which called for creating a system to select men for military service based on national need of a population at risk of between the ages of 21 to 31 as of the registration day. The registration day, so think about the timeline here, and you know, college students complain about deadlines themselves. Congress passes the Declaration of War and passes the Selective Service Act in April of 1917. The military and the administrative state have the selective service system ready to register the entire adult male population of the United States. That is, that population between the ages of 21 and 31 by June of that year. They throw it together in like 2 to 3 months. Pretty impressive. Doubt we could do that now. But one of the things that it requires is it requires leveraging pretty much every arm of the government, state, local, the post office. Everything has to come together for you to do that type of massive registration of the adult male population. But let's go to the PowerPoint, and then we're going to go to a couple other places. So we are going to share our screen. And here we go. And maybe not. Here we go. All right, here we go. So I'm going to talk about the pandemic in a bit. So contemporaneous to World War I, you have a massive influenza pandemic that literally kills twice as many people as the war itself. So depending on your estimates, the flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919 ranges from 20 to 40 million people, whereas only 10 million people died in the war. This was also when human population, remember population growth is exponential, is much, much smaller. So a larger proportion of the world got killed by the flu pandemic of 1917 to 1919. So one of the things that you run into in the progressive aspect of the war was selective service, where you have people registering for military service in June. And using punch card technology, they were able to identify how many bodies they had at their disposal within 24 hours. And the first registrants were called up in September. Those people had to be basically trained, and then they were deployed. Sorry. In the fighting season of 1918. Of course, November of 1918 is when the armistice is declared. So again, the Americans are only deployed for one fighting season. But in this process of creating this military apparatus, you have the creation of the Selective Service Act, you have the War Industry Board, where American manufacturing production shifts from consumer goods to military hardware and equipment. The War Industries Board not only shifts production, it also sets prices, it also sets wages, it also keeps people from striking, because again, a strike or a work stoppage would be advantageous to the enemy. Now, one of the things that you run into and this is the "We Are the Barbarians." Okay, the Germans, German Americans, they run into some problems because, again, you've had German-speaking peoples in the Ohio River Valley and in the United States for many, many years. One of the things that this does is you have a patriotic and propaganda incentive to Americanize the Germans. And so all of a sudden, Schmitz becomes Smiths. You start having you have the hamburger is renamed. You have sauerkraut dropping off. You have a number of things getting renamed to sound more patriotic and to sound less German. You have towns changing their names. You have people changing their names. It really is an interesting cultural purge. The other thing that you have in this great cause of freedom is you have the creation of a Ministry of Propaganda. You have the creation of the Committee of Public Information that had two purposes. One was to provide information that made the state look good and to suppress information that made the war effort look bad. And so you have a large number of propaganda packets coming out to, again, drum up willing enlistments, to drum up cooperation, to prevent strikes, to prevent civil unrest. You also have a number of paid informants who are literally snitching out on their neighbors for unpatriotic settlements. You have the arrests of pacifists and socialists. You have, again, this administrative state has no qualms stepping on people's rights and liberties in pursuit of a war that they feel is abjectly justified, and shut up and cooperate. You also have an emboldenment of this sort of moral crusade behind the war. The war is seen as a moral exercise. You have the English-speaking peoples as the bringers of civilization against the barbarous Huns. Well, one of the other things that you have in this push towards civilizing the world is, again, women's suffrage pushes forward in the time of the war and even afterwards. So women actually get the vote in the 19th Amendment. They first participate, their first presidential election. 1920, the 19th Amendment is ratified. And with women entering the political fray, you have the, you also have the, so it goes 18th Amendment, you have prohibition. 19th Amendment, you have women's suffrage. Prohibition was driven in large part by these progressives thinking, okay, we're running industrialized war, there's a patriotic duty, we're not going to divert food supplies into fermentation. Also, there's a little bit of racism involved. This was decrying the drinking mores of the Germans, the drinking mores of the Eastern European immigrants. And so the war itself becomes a driver in these rather salient, almost authoritarian progressive movements. So here we have women protesting for the right to vote. Here we have the spread of prohibition. So prohibition begins kind of locally before it becomes a constitutional amendment. Actually, as a matter of fact, there are still dry counties in Texas where you can't buy hard liquor. I used to live in one. That was interesting. I grew up in cities, and I was like, what do you mean? But anyway, so the other thing you have is the abject suppression of civil liberties. You have Congress passing the Espionage Act, which prohibited spying, interfering with the draft, publishing articles that might be useful to the enemy. Well, okay, what's useful to the enemy? That's left entirely up to the discretion of federal prosecutors. You have the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to speak out against the war, because if you're speaking out against the war, maybe you're trying to overthrow the state. Maybe you're a closet communist and you're trying to do in the United States what the Russian revolutionaries did in the Russian Empire, which was overthrow the state and assassinate the leadership. So some of these are, yes, we need to have a well-ordered state to fight this war, but it's also a response to the Russian Revolution, which undid the state in Russia. One of the most prominent victims was Eugene V. Debs, who was the socialist candidate for president, who will run for president while in prison. And some of these draconian uses of the state apparatus to monitor dissent will persist and be used against communists after the war is over. At the conclusion of the war, you have the creation of the FBI to monitor communist insurgents. So here you have a war bond. So one of the things you have to recognize is prior to, at this point in American history, the government just can't print money. Money has to be backed by hard currency or by precious metals. And so people would take their cash, silver or gold, and they would buy Liberty bonds if they were people of means. And this is how you finance the war, with this idea that the government would repay the bond after the war in a certain period of time. Here you have a sketch of the Statue of Liberty and warplanes. Here you have a miners on strike. These strikes were promptly put down. And so again, production has to be maintained. But through these coercive means, and largely due to American logistical power in the war, this administrative state will seem to work because the United States is victorious. Well, this has consequences downrange when you have to demobilize the troops and transition back into a post-war economy. And so I want to touch on that on the next slide, or on the next video. So I'm going to stop here. And, no, I'm going to stop the share. Here we go. So I'm going to stop the slide here. So, one of the things that you have to recognize in times of war, and this kind of sounds like the old saying from Cicero, in times of war, the law falls silent. And so Americans in times of national crisis have allowed their liberties to be trampled on. Well, once the crisis is over, after the war is over and demobilization begins, you have a new negotiated relationship as people return from war and as the new economy emerges. And we will address some of that in the next lecture. Thank you.